Good afternoon, morning, or evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to the HDRO IIEP OPHI joint series on multidimensional poverty. Coming to you today from the meeting room A of the Oxford Department of International Development and online from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I'm James Foster, the Carr Professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs, and I'll be moderating today's second installment of this term series on the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or MPI. This is usually, and is this time going to be sponsored by, as well, the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, or OPHI, the Human Development Report Office of the UNDP, and the Institute for International Economic Policy here at the Elliott School. Today's presentation is on Bhutan's Gross National Happiness Index, a measure of human flourishing, which uses the structure of the MPI, but with a positive orientation. We have with us the key experts on this topic, Tshoki Zangmo, and Sabina will be joining us in a moment, both of which are from, of course, Oxford. For today's presentation, in just a moment, I'll provide a brief introduction of today's main speaker, but first I'd like to thank the sponsors of the series, IIEP, OPHI, and HDRO, for their continued support and for sharing the power of measurement as a tool for addressing the needs of people. Last week, in an exciting session, Sabina Alkire presented the newest results on the global MPI, measuring acute multidimensional poverty for 110 developing countries. Next week, on the 23rd of October, we will be joined by Dr. Ajkar Adilzadeh, Director and Chief Economic Modeler of Applied Development Research Solutions. So we look forward to hearing what he has to say. I would like now to introduce Tshoki Zangmo, who is a research officer at OPHI and who's been working on the Gross National Happiness Index for the government of Bhutan since 2009. She's also worked in UNDP's Innovation and Strategic Foresight Unit, designing strategies to investigate new trends and potential issues that could impact the global development landscape. Tshoki has a bachelor's in science from Delhi University in India and a master's degree in applied statistics from Australian National University, ANU, and has other training and experience in public administration. Her most recent paper is on the workforce in Bhutan and can be found on UNDP's Bhutan website. Welcome, Tshoki. The floor is yours.
Thank you, James. I hope I'm audible. Thank you for the kind introduction. So let me first of all share my slide before diving in. Just give me a moment. All right. Yep. I hope it's visible.
Yes, it's great.
And yeah, so the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, I mean, OPHI, has been collaborating with the Royal Government of Bhutan to develop the Gross National Happiness Index since 2009, and so it's been a very old friendship that OPHI has kind of matured with the government of Bhutan. But before I continue with my presentation, I would like to take this, like to request permission to perhaps, because I already see my internet wobbling. So if it's okay, I'm going to put off my video just so that there is uninterrupted flow.
Perfect.
So please bear with me. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so yeah, just to continue on this presentation. So this is just the outline of the presentation today, and more or less what I'm trying to do here with my first slide is kind of introduce Bhutan. It's a Buddhist nation, and it's such a small population, less than 1 million of us. And throughout history, Bhutan has been consistently, prioritizing the environment, valuing its cultural heritage as kind of the cornerstone for a robust national identity, while also directing towards well-being and happiness of the people. And perhaps because of these kind of values, it was a fourth king back in the 1970s that he introduced this concept of gross national happiness. And what did he introduce with what did he mean when he introduced this concept was that he actually emphasized that there are multiple determinants of happiness and well-being, and economic being just one of those determinants. And what he did is he diverted Bhutan's attention to all those other non-monetary aspects like culture and environment and social relationships and so on. And those determinants were often found to be ignored back then in the early 1970s. But for Bhutan, since the introduction of this development philosophy of gross national happiness, our policies, if you look at our policies or laws or regulations, they've been mostly inspired or closely aligned with this notion of looking at progress from a very multi-dimensional approach. But then it was not enough. Soon the policy makers realized that just having GNH as a concept or just as a vision was not enough. The government thought that there's a lack of a measurement, especially if you want to have certain directions for your policies and programs. It's important that you have some kind of a yardstick, and especially I think the need was felt more during the transition from our obsolete monarchy to democracy. So there was a lot of deliberations among think tanks of the government, among sectoral heads, among senior bureaucrats of how do we internalize this concept, and more importantly, how do we develop this new measure for gross national happiness that goes beyond an income. And thus there was this the journey began in early 2000s, and the entire government bodies, including ministries and sectors and representatives from NGOs and CSOs, they came together to develop this measure for gross national happiness. It was a very collective approach, and I'm very fortunate that I was part of it. There was different levels of committees set up. They were assigned responsibilities. They had focal points. And there was this main working committee, which was led by the Center for Bhutan and GNH Studies, who was a think tank of the government. And they had two responsibilities. First one was to develop some kind of a framework or a dashboard or indicator, some kind of a structural framework for GNH. And the second responsibility was to develop some kind of a robust method so that the index could help steer policies based on the GNH values and principles. And at last, of course, we found a method, and the method is, of course, later Sabina is going to be explaining in her video. Actually, perhaps at this point of time, perhaps I will request Hachi, because to share the video, the pre-recorded video from Sabina Alkire, who's the director of OPHI, who unfortunately could not be here due to prior commitment. So she came in contact with the Royal Government of Bhutan back in 2007 when the Alkire-Foster method was being tested in some of the countries, and it was such a blessing. I still remember the first virtual meeting that we had, and how things actually fell into place, and then ultimately the Alkire-Foster method fulfilled all the conditions that was actually required for the computation of GNH Index. So yeah, with this, I'll end it here, and I'll request Hachi to share that video, which will talk about the index methodology as well as the structure of the GNH Index. So over to you, Hachi. Thank you.
I hope everyone's able to see the screen. Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So how is the 22 Gross National Happiness Index of the Royal Government of Bhutan computed? The GNH Index has 9 domains and 33 indicators. The domains cover the normal health, education, and living standard domains, but also governance, ecological diversity and resilience, and time use, and then community vitality, cultural diversity and resilience, and psychological well-being. Each of these domains is measured by 2 to 4 indicators, for a total of 33 indicators. The GNH survey gathered data for each one of these 33 indicators, and then each person is coded as having sufficient or insufficient attainments in each of the 33 indicators. This creates their sufficiency profile. You can see where they are deprived and where they have the causes and conditions of GNH across all 33 of the weighted indicators. And this is averaged into a sufficiency score. Cutoffs are then applied to this sufficiency score to identify who at a broad level is happy or not yet happy by the GNH index, but also a gradient of happiness is computed with different levels of well-being. Also, among the not yet happy, that is the group that are important for policy purposes, they still have some achievements, and so the average sufficiency among them is computed. The two numbers, the percentage of people who are happy, the percentage of people who are not happy, and then these average sufficiency score is combined to obtain the GNH index. So let's go through that a little bit slowly. As I mentioned, for each of the 33 indicators pictured on the left, there are conditions, so the person either has sufficiency or not. For example, a person is sufficient in the indicator healthy days, or if she or he had at least 26 healthy days when they were not off sick during the recent month. So let's create a very simplified profile of sufficiency. So let's say that person did not have 26 healthy days, so they would be deprived in that indicator. In community vitality, one might consider a person sufficient if they volunteer at least 3 days and donate 10% of their household income, or they donate double either of the income or the time. And our particular person has sufficiency in donations of time and money, which is a real indicator in the community vitality dimension. In psychological well-being, one indicator is positive emotions. And if the person regularly experiences some of compassion, generosity, forgiveness, contentment, or calmness, that person has sufficiency. So our suggested person is sufficient in that indicator. An indicator in cultural diversity is participation. If the person participates in cultural activities at least 6 days per year, then they have sufficiency, and our person is sufficient. In housing, there's an indicator in living standard of housing, and that is sufficient if the roof is strong, if the toilet is improved, and if there are less than 2 persons per room, and our person is sufficient. And finally, there's an indicator of political participation, which is in the governance dimension and records whether the person intends to vote in the next elections, or if they regularly attend community meetings. Our person is deprived because their voting district is far away from where they now live, and they do not intend to go back and vote. To create the sufficiency score, we mark a person as having 1 if they're sufficient and 0 if they are deprived. And you can see that in 5 of these 7 indicators, 4 of the 6 indicators, they are sufficient. So what is their sufficiency score? It's the percentage of weighted indicators in which they have sufficiency. Let's use equal weights. So that's 4 out of 6, or 2/3, 67%. That's their sufficiency score. Using that sufficiency score, we can identify where each person falls on the happiness gradient. For example, if one person has 82%, then they would be very high on the sufficiency scale. Our person has 67%, and that is above the cutoff of 66%, which is the minimum required to be considered to have the causes and conditions of happiness. For short, we term that GNH happy. But the 4 categories is that a person whose sufficiency score is less than 50% is called unhappy, not having any causes and conditions, or few causes and conditions. If it's between half and 2/3, they're narrowly happy. Between 2/3 and 77%, it's extensively. And above 77%, they're identified as deeply happy. And as mentioned, if they are extensively or deeply happy, they are considered, according to the GNH Index, to have the causes and conditions of happiness. But if it's less than 60%, 66%, they are considered not yet happy. So our person, Jerme, is sufficient in 67% of the weighted GNH indicators, and he is classified as extensively happy and as GNH happy. That is how we identify each person in the data set. So for example, we might consider 4 people, Jerme, Pelke, Sonam, and Wangchen, and we're going to compute a GNH index across them. And S means sufficiency and D means deprivation. So Pelke, for example, has sufficiency in healthy days, donation, positive emotion, but she's deprived in cultural participation. But that's her only deprivation. In contrast, Sonam is deprived in 4 out of the 6 indicators. So we mark all of the sufficiencies with a 1 and the deprivations with a 0, as before. And then we count the sufficiency. So it's 4 for Jerme, 5 for Pelke, 2 for Sonam, and 3 for Wangchu. Then we can create their sufficiency score. Jerme is 4 by 6. Pelke is 5 by 6, or 83%. Sonam is 2 out of 6, which is 1/3. And Wangchu is half, 50%. So then we can mark each person, and there's 1 person in each of the 4 categories. And so we can locate them on the happiness gradient. For the GNH index, we focus on those who are deeply or extensively happy, and it's 2 out of 4 people. So half of the population have GNH, are GNH happy. And again, half of the population lack GNH, they are not yet happy. The average sufficiency score among the not yet happy people is 50 plus 33 divided by 2, or 42%. So those are the only numbers you need to compute the GNH index. Why do we look at average sufficiency among the not yet happy? Because they do have some achievements, and policy wants to build on those achievements so that they can pass the 67% line. Why don't we focus so much on the average sufficiency of the happy people? It's because freedom and ways of experiencing well-being are diverse. And so we want people to have the freedom to opt out of certain indicators and sufficiency in them, if that is not part of their understanding of a fulfilled and flourishing life. So the GNH index is a policy tool, and it uses 3 numbers: the percentage of people who are happy, the percentage of people who are not yet happy, and the average sufficiency score among the not yet happy. How does it combine them? It's very simple. For the people who are happy, we get full credit. So 50% of the population have the causes and conditions of happiness. They contribute directly to the GNH index. For the people who are not yet happy, what contributes to the GNH index are the indicators in which they have sufficiency. So we adjust the population by their average sufficiency score. So 50% of the population are only sufficient in 42% of the indicators. So 50 times 42% is 0.021. And so you can think that those 50% of the people only contribute 21% to the GNH index. And so overall, it would be 71. And so when we aggregate this, we aggregate it into this score and recall that if the value is 0, then it is nobody has happiness, nobody has sufficiency. And 1 is a perfect score where everyone has the causes and conditions of happiness and no one is unhappy. So in what we looked at, we add up the 50% plus 50% times 42% or 21%. And so that's 71%, which is written 0.710. So that, my friends, is how to compute the GNH index as it's used in Bhutan. Here is the formula written out. And here are some key terms that might be useful as you go through the GNH index report. In addition to the 4 that I've introduced, one wants to know among the people who are happy or are unhappy, in what percentage of domains and dimensions do they enjoy sufficiency, and in which are they deprived? And this is done by doing indicator headcount ratios, either censored, i.e. only for the people who are happy or unhappy, or uncensored for the entire population of Bhutan. And we can look at the percentage of people who have sufficiency or who are deprived. And that really helps policy because sufficiency, one recognizes the achievements of Bhutan. And in terms of deprivation headcounts, one knows what policy needs to act upon to increase GNH index in the next round. Thank you so much, and Tashidele.
Thank you, Lachi. Let me reshare my screen. I hope it's visible. Yeah. So so what Sabina explained, it took more than 4 years for us to establish the structure, the 9 dimensions, the 3 indicators, a lot of piloting to test the reliability and the validity of these indicators, and really to build some kind of a foundation or a baseline, and that was done back in 2010. Now, as Sabina explained, based on how much of these causes and conditions are being met, we through the application of the Alkire-Foster method, we classify them into 4 groups of people. For instance, again, as Sabina mentioned earlier, if an individual meets most of the 33 indicators, that is about 77% of those 33 indicators, then they are classified as deeply happy. And likewise, if they meet only some of the conditions, then narrowly happy, and so on, as you see here on the screen. But then, of course, happiness, we understand happiness and well-being, sometimes it's a deeply personal matter. And the number and the range of conditions that a person needs to fulfill to be happy varies from person to person, from household to household. And really, we do not deny the complexity at play here, but for the purposes of policy decision, it was very useful for us to draw a line, like a overall happiness cutoff. So for GNH index, as Sabina mentioned, the cutoff was 66%, meaning that for any policy attention, we focus on those who have only met less than 66% of the 33 GNH conditions. Now to dive into some of the findings of 2022, as well as we also have a time series. We have done the first national survey back in 2010, and then we had in 2015, and then the recent one last year. So as you can see here, the share of unhappy and narrowly happy that actually formed the not yet happy group has decreased over time. And also, if you look at the GNH index value itself, it has slightly increased since 2010. Between 2010 and 2022, GNH increased along with these two components, you know, the share of happy people and the average sufficiency amongst the not yet happy group. Comparing the GNH index value in 2022 with this value in 2015, we also see there's a significant increase from 0.756 to 0.781. But the increase was faster, and the increase was faster than 2010, 2015. The incidence also, you can, as you can observe, it rose by 4.7 percentage points. And it was, the incidence of happy people was also, you know, the rise was faster in 2015 to 2022 as compared to 2010 to 2015. And again, as Sabina mentioned, some of the ways of analyzing and what this Alkire-Foster method allows was to look at sufficiency levels at through two key measures. The first one was what the technical term is the uncensored sufficiency headcount ratio, but it's simply the share of the population who have achieved sufficiency in each of these indicators. And here you have the result for 2022. We see that a lot of indicators, conventional indicators like living standard or education and health, like they have improved. However, it's not all always rosy. I mean, there are some indicators that have deteriorated across time, and these are the unconventional ones. Like we have Diglam Namja, which is actually an indicator for a traditional etiquette, you know, how we practice ourselves or conduct ourselves in public. That has decreased. Political participation, unfortunately, has also decreased. The other measure is the censored sufficiency headcount, which is simply the share of people who are also classified as happy but also sufficient. So it's kind of satisfying two conditions. And the result here is across 2015 and 2022. And we observe here again that there's a significant decline in cultural participation. There's a drop of about 14.3% in 2022 compared to 2015. And we did a bit of a follow-up studies also why this declined. And we found out that maybe this is attributed to this, the far-reaching impacts of pandemic, you know, which necessitated various measures such as lockdowns and social distancing, and also quarantine to safeguard public health. So there was a lot of precautions that was taken that could have had unintended consequences in terms of cultural participation. And again, as cited earlier, there was this drop in political participation, and it is a matter of concern. And this decline is reflective of the two key sub-indicators, because this political participation is made up of two sub-indicators, mainly people's willingness to vote. And the second one is the frequency of attendance in terms of village and town level meetings. So both has gone down over time. This just calls for more policy interventions that could foster these kind of attendance from the public. In terms of the GNH index by area of residence, we can see that there has been improvement both in the rural and urban areas in 2015 compared to 2010. However, in 2022, if you have a look, I mean, while the GNH index has improved among rural residents, it saw a decrease among urban residents in 2022 compared to 2015. And you can also see that in 2022, the GNH index for rural increased from 0.771 to 0.771, sorry, from 0.731 in 2015, which actually roughly translates to 5.6, but you don't see the same in the among the urban residents. In fact, there's a decrease of about 1.8%. And likewise, we can also look at the AF method. Lets us do this kind of subgroup analysis, similar to the national trends, even across both regions, rural and urban. We see a decrease in the sufficiency levels in terms of the cultural participation indicators, in terms of the traditional etiquette practice indicators. Likewise, if we do this analysis by gender, we see that GNH index for both males and females saw an improvement over the years since 2010, and that the rate of increase is much higher among females than males in both 2015 as well as 2022, indicating perhaps equalizing changes or narrowing the gap between male and females. However, the males still have a higher GNH index compared to female. Furthermore, we also do a lot of district level analysis, and in Bhutan, there are 20 districts, and out of that, 7 districts are identified as high performing districts, as you can see. Then there are another 7 that is in the medium performing districts, and the remaining 6 would be at the lower end of the GNH index ranking. Of course, again, we can also look into conducting some kind of a detailed analysis on each of these districts, what changed over time across, because the sample itself is district representative. And we can also have district level analysis help identify happiness hotspots or specific areas or regions that are most happy and what is making that region happy. And by tracking changes in happiness rates across district level, decision makers is also able to evaluate the effectiveness of any GNH improvement policies and programs and make adjustments, as and when necessary. So GNH index in Bhutan, what it has helped us was to basically zoom into this multiple, causes and conditions. That's the 3 causes and conditions, and how individuals and households are experiencing and living in. And also at the same time, zoom out to gain a sense of a wider well-being picture that not only looks at individuals, bank balance, but also at the non-monetizable aspects that are otherwise often overlooked in policy making. Now for the 2022 GNH survey, we did something additional. We did a lot of profiling. We identified several profiles of happy individuals in Bhutan, and these are people who have at least achieved, 66% of the sufficiency score criteria used to measure the GNH. And as you can see, I'm going to narrate some of the profiles here. Some of the criteria include happy profiles who have very low income, but have very strong social ties and perhaps access to good services and a healthy work-life balance. And just to narrate a few, this profile is about Doji, is on Doji Kelsen, who is a Bank of Bhutan employee, has been working there for 14 years with a Bachelor of Business Management degree. He's married, father of 2 children. In our data, he's been classified as deeply happy because, he has a sufficiency score of about 80% of the 33 weighted indicators. While he has achieved high income sufficiency, he also has vibrant family, community relationships, is in good health, and is satisfied with services provided in his communities. But there are certain shortcomings as well. He often finds himself working overtime, and he's not so good in the time use domain. Likewise, we also found from a very remote area, Karmal Haden, who's 70-year-old. She's a farmer. She has been classified as extremely happy, which means she has, satisfaction, or she has met those conditions of being fulfilled in at least 70% of the 33 GNH parameters. She has been a farmer her entire life and has recently retired. She's illiterate. Husband has died, but she has kids, and she particularly ranks really high in terms of psychological well-being, which means her mental health is very good. and also in terms of ecological diversity and resilience domain. And she spends most of her time engaged in spiritual pursuits right now. And she's very, she's very happy to be living in a community, and she has this great sense of belongingness where she's living. Likewise, there are other profiles that also came up. Pema Churin, 28 years old, and likewise, there were some profiles that were younger, like 17, 16-year-old students who are also classified as extremely happy. And what these stories tell and helped inform the policymakers was give this candid picture, this human story of what the GNH Index means on grounds. So over time, I think it has been such a long journey since 2009 to develop a measure for GNH that preserve this, multidimensional aspect of well-being. It allows us to track and monitor progress. It helps us to prioritize policy areas, and it also helped in a lot of cases to align the sectoral goals and objectives with GNH, with well-being and happiness. However, moving on, it has been also very vital to review these 33 indicators, especially in the light of the achievements, how far we have achieved these 33 indicators, and in terms of also its relevancy and the evolving development context of Bhutan. So this is what's happening right now as I present. The Center for Bhutan Studies is currently trying to review each of the 33 indicators. Some of the indicators, for instance, there is under living standard, for instance, under housing indicator of the living standard dimension, there is an indicator which talks about water accessibility. Now, Bhutan has achieved about 99.9%. Almost all the households, right? Almost every household has access to water. So then we might need to replace it with something that is of an issue at this point of time. So there's a lot of review going on, and this is something that's also very important. Of course, there's a challenge in terms of having changes over time analysis, but at the end of the day, for policymakers, for the Royal Government of Bhutan, what's important is how relevant and in terms of usability of GNH Index. So as a next step, what they're doing is reviewing the indicator structure. With this, I'll end. I think we are a bit over time, but yes, over to James for any questions, queries, or I don't know, how does this work?
Well, first of all, I get on and tell the people who are in the virtual audience that they can put their questions into Q&A on the Zoom platform. That's the first thing I'd say. And you can do it at any moment, and we'll look through them. As well at OPHI, what would you do on the ground there in OPHI, please?
So if anyone in the room has questions for the speaker, I think we don't know how well the mics are working around the room. So if you can speak up, and if not, I can relay the question to the speaker. So if anybody has any questions, please let us know. Meanwhile, we can take some questions from online, if any online participants have any questions.
I'm sure we do, but I'm going to start myself with just an observation. I really think it's amazing to someone like myself, sitting in my individualistic environment in an office where the ethos is that everyone is doing their own thing for themselves and moving forward, individual hand coming down and making sure that it all works out, but it's still an individualistic approach. How could you advise other societies as to the possibility of creating such an index which includes not only materialistic aspects, but non-material aspects of life that are valuable to people? What are your insights that you might be able to offer other countries, or have offered other countries through time? I'd love to hear a little bit more on that issue, if you would, please.
Thanks, James. It's a very loaded question. It's an interesting and very relevant, timely. I think for Bhutan, it's been very natural, very organic, how this development process came about. Even before 1970s, even before His Majesty coined the term gross national happiness. If you look back into our laws, one of the oldest laws back in, I think it was in 10th century, there's a phrase in that scriptures which says that the ultimate purpose of governance is to increase people's happiness and well-being. So I think it comes very naturally in terms of our cultural values, and it meshes very well with also the practices that has evolved since the 10th or 7th century. And that is one of the reasons why I feel GNH is, if I may say, especially the measurement of GNH is a success in Bhutan, because there is this very organic willingness to adopt it. And the fact that even in families, you know, as you grow up, it's always about collective happiness. It's never about the individual needs. It's always about the collective, about the village, the community, you know, the well-being of the community. So that takes precedence in most of the choices and the decisions that's made at a household level. So that's kind of the structure we are built in. And I think that has it's a huge contributing factor to why, you know, policymakers, the academia, the NGOs, the CEOs, they all came together and they just felt the need. Okay, we have this beautiful concept. Now it's just, it's not just enough to have GDP. We need our own measure that also talks about something beyond income. So to answer you, the first, I think it's very natural as a Bhutanese. It's like a way of life to always look at the middle, have a balance of both the material and the non-material. In terms of, I guess, showing it or trying to ensure that these kind of practices are done globally, I think there has been a lot of collaborations, but not necessarily at a very national level. There has been collaborations in terms of community-wise. We have a community in Brazil, for instance, that's practicing. There are so many collaborations in the academic world. Now there are some international organizations that are recognizing these efforts. We are collaborating with OECD, UN, and so on and so forth. So I think we are being heard, but not necessarily in terms of policy, you know, institutionalization in the government process. That I haven't seen so far with any of the governments that we have worked in. But in terms of the academia and at a community level, yes, there has been a lot of collaborations. But it's challenging because this is something that's, you know, we are going against the tide, and the tide is the social media. It's always greed, it's always consumerism. It's so, yeah, there is a lot of, you know, external forces that's giving us some, you know, contradicting messages. So it's very challenging, even for Bhutan. I'll end here, and I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Does make sense. Yes, thank you so much. Really, that was very clear. I'm going to let the Oxford room to respond. Do you have any questions? Because I sure have another one.
Yes, we have one question.
Hello, my name is Joyce. Thank you so much. It's been very insightful. My question is quite similar to James's. Is that his name? Yes. And so I want to ask specifically about what you think the role of religion might play in all of this. Because we tend to think that going more scientific makes us more developed. But sometimes at the core, you realize that even in rural areas, that sense of belonging to a religious community or having a belief or practice go to the core of centering you and making you feel content and essentially happy, right? And so to what extent would you attribute part of that happiness to being religious people?
Can I add? Because mine is also related to that. Should I come? Or...
Are you guys able to hear Usha online?
I'll probably come.
Yes. Okay. Usha will
Yes.
Hi, James. Hi, Tshoki. Thank you for such a good presentation. Your name is?
Joyce from Ghana.
So I'm going to just add to what Joyce said, and a bit more on the sociological side.
Yeah.
So this is my statement, and I'm wondering if you want to challenge the statement or not. So my statement is that this particular measure, the design of this measure, most likely is applicable for a society who's monocultural and or a large proportion of the society not only identifies but also practices a single religion. So that's my statement. You're more than welcome to push back on this. Thank you.
Oh, can I just add to that?
Yeah, Joyce on that too.
Just sort of tweak it a bit. So I come from Ghana, where about 60% of us are Christians. We've got 30% Muslims, and then the rest African traditional religion. So it might not be singular per se, because even social media-wise, we tend to take things very lightly. We have the sense of humor. We laugh about everything, including even the serious ones. But every Sunday, every Friday, there are prayer rooms. People just get to practice their religion freely, and that sort of negates the whole obsession with material things and consumerism and stuff like that. So maybe not a singular religion, but the fact that people are able to access and practice and question, just the fact that there is some religious activity that's welcomed and received helps. Thank you.
Right. So go ahead and answer, Tshoki.
Thanks, James, and thank you for the interesting questions. The first one, okay, I think Buddhism might have a hand, because if you look at most of the proclamations and the royal addresses from the author, which is our fourth king, you'll see a lot of Buddhist values, and there's this like a complete overlap with the concept of GNH. It talks about balance. Even in Buddhism, we have this middle path where we are trying to balance between the monetary and the non-monetary. And even in GNH, we do that, right? In Buddhism, there's a lot of talk on interdependence, interconnectedness, about how dependent we are. We are social beings. GNH also is all about that. It's about interdependence. Buddhism is all about wholesome, holistic living, and likewise GNH. So obviously, because about 99.9% of our Buddhists, his man is Buddhist, and he's been highly his values are Buddhist. So obviously there will be a certain influence of where this GNH is coming from. And I would like to believe, although it's not written out in black and white, I'd like to believe that GNH is actually a remnant of Buddhist values. In terms of Usha's question, very interesting one, that whether it's applicable to heterogeneous society. Again, if you look at some of the, majority of the indicators and structure, I would humbly submit it's universal in its application. Living standards, what are we talking about? We are talking about assets, housing, and household per capita income. In terms of environment, we are talking about lack of, we want an environment where there's no pollution, there's no air pollution, river pollution, water pollution, and so on. These are basic things that's required for any society to thrive on, right? In terms of community vitality, we are talking about interdependence, helping people or your neighbors or your community members in times of need. Donation, it could be time and money. We're talking about safety, we're talking about family relationships. Now, these are universal. It transcends religion, if I may submit. And in terms of good governance, we're talking about, having no corruption, having a very good structure that provides us with fundamental rights and freedoms, gives us good services. Cultural diversity and resilience is also about, in terms of the local community festivals. It might be for Bhutan, it's going to be Bhutanese. If it's going to be applied in India, it's going to be Indian festivals and so on, that the community holds very, dear to their hearts. So again, with education, likewise for time use, also work-life balance is something that is relevant, whether you're whether you're Malaysian, Usha, or whether someone is American like James. So I think it transcends, right? It transcends religion, is what I'm trying to say with this indicators and structure, and it's very universal, and that was very intentionally done.
Got it.
That's I would feel, but again, there has been at an academic level some localization efforts in India. For instance, the Assam state, what they've done is they've tried to take the structure and try to localize some of the indicators. So that is, I feel, very possible even for advanced economies as well as for developing economies. I'm a optimist, so I feel it could be done. And then the third one, I think it relates with this, the second question, right? The third question also about being it. I think it's applicable whether it's a Christian community or a Buddhist or a Hindu community or whether it's a Muslim. I feel because there's a universality nature of these indicators. And the intent, what's more important is the intent, which is to improve the well-being of a society, collective happiness. So I feel given that intent, it would be applicable across all cultures and societies. That's it. Over for now.
Okay, back here.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful discussion. Really appreciate all of that. I have a question in the Q&A that I'd like to address. Victoria said, thanks, that's very interesting. I wonder if happiness is related to not knowing other possibilities in life. In other words, sometimes your expectations and happiness can depend on what you see outside. And the question is, does that have a potential for when you learn more, when you understand more, you go on the media and you see how others are living, as well as conditioned by different types of religious beliefs or what you've seen in your lifetime. How does that all interact to create what you call happiness or flourishing, and how would it be impacted by these expectations?
Thanks, James. Thank you. And thank you for the question. Yes, I do agree that, and we have come across during this measurement process, there are a lot of people, they actually conceptualize happiness as like a relative concept, in the fact that as long as they don't know that this kind of a luxury conditions existed, they are happy. But as soon as they get exposed to social media, and then they feel that their happiness is going down. But again, and that's actually at a different level, because if you look at the makeup of this GNH index, and as I cited earlier, these are like I would say like a basic set of conditions. It's not talking about the luxuries that, that you need to afford a car, that you need to afford the certain branded designer clothes and so on. And that's like a next level, right? We are simply talking about this basic set of causes and conditions that is required for a person or a household or a society to be able to pursue happiness. We are not even saying that if you have these 33 conditions, you're going to be happy. That's not a guarantee again, because happiness is a subjective matter. We are going a bit, 1 degree further away from happiness. The GNH index is just talking about the conditions. At times, there are some people who might have fulfilled all this 33 basic set of conditions, but again, they might be unhappy. There could be cases like that. So for this basic set of conditions, I feel it's okay. It's actually not the the lacking concept that you were referring to. And also the fact this Alkire-Foster method, what it does, and it's very interesting, useful for measuring GNH, is because you're saying that not all the 33 conditions needs to be fulfilled. There are some cases that you can have about 70% of the conditions fulfilled and still you'll be classified as happy. You might have like 80% or 69%, for instance, as long as it's making the mark of 66%. So it's not, again, really trying to force all those 33 conditions. So to answer your question, the first one is, I feel these are like basic set of conditions. It's not talking something that's really trying to compare and make, happiness a very relative, keeping up with the Jones. So that's a different concept, and we are definitely not measuring that concept. And the second of all is we are not also saying that all the 33 conditions needs to be fulfilled. It's actually up to the principle of that person, and it's kind of a human right? It's not like you're forcing those 33 conditions on a person to be happy. And there was a lot of deliberations back then with the policymakers. What should be the happiness cutoff? How much is enough for a person to be happy? And it took I think about 6 months for us to come to 36%. And there were so many reasons. One was, of course, the freedom for the people to make a choice that they're okay. And some also, there was this, the relevancy of these indicators. Because for some, as you can see in some of the indicators, they are very rural focused, like wildlife damage. It's not it does not occur in an urban setting. Likewise, there were some indicators that would be very localized or attuned to a particular section of society. So that was also one of the reasons. But yeah, I would say that these are definitely not talking about the relative kind of happiness that is often, again, that's another subject matter, and there's a ton of literature out there. It's mostly, it's very universal, very basic set of conditions, but of course, looking at this 9 holistic dimensions. And if you actually break down your 24-hour period, you'll see that each of those minutes and seconds that you're going through, they are either directly or indirectly related to this 9 dimensions. They're just saying that you need to have a balance across this 9 dimensions. And this is from the royal government perspective. I think they're saying this is a basic, basic set of conditions that needs to be fulfilled. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed. I thought I'd just run right over to Sabina, who has appeared mysteriously on the playlist there. So Sabina, did you want to make a comment or add to what's been discussed, or just say hello?
Hello, and gratitudes for the link. No, I just wanted to say 2 things, and Tshoki can correct me, but I believe that Bhutan also is religiously plural and has a Hindu minority. And I believe that, for example, the questions on spirituality, the consideration of karma in daily life, and those that they were tested by CBS to ensure that they were also relevant for a religious minority. And so the language, because karma, that term is used by both, for example. So I think that might be something, Tshoki, that you could just comment on a little bit. And I also tapped a little bit of reflection to Victoria's question, just linking it to Amartya Sen's work on adaptive preferences, Carol Graham's book on happy peasants, miserable millionaires, but ending where Tshoki ended, that let's say in 8 of the domains, you are very sufficient, but in psychological well-being, you're grumpy and depressed. Or let's say you have the same attainments in those 8 domains, but you are joyous and don't have frustration. Clearly that mental state is better in the second situation. And so although there is an interconnectedness, frames of reference, all of the challenges we know for subjective indicators, I think how this is marked as another dimension tried, and you can criticize us, improve us, whatever, but it tried to give an independent voice to that subjective domain. Over.
Would you care to have a quick follow-up comment, Tshoki?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so we did have this, I mentioned 4 years, right? It took us 4 years. So there was a lot of piloting and testing of this questionnaire, especially under the spiritual section. And that one was one of the reasons is we not only had a Hindu minority, we also had Muslim and Christianity. So we translated those questionnaires into our local languages, did a lot of tests, and we found out that a lot of these values of spirituality and the negative and positive emotions, for instance, they really resonated well. It was because our attempt at the end of the day, the policymakers, the government of Bhutan, was to make it as secular as possible and as universal as possible. So that was the intent. And we tried, I think, for over the period of 4 years. Over to you, James. Thank you.
Great. Let me turn it to back to Oxford in the big room, if there's any questions.
Yes.
Do we have a question? We have two questions.
Ah, okay, then let's proceed.
Can you hear me from here?
Are you able to hear me?
So my question's about water specifically, and thinking about how this applies internationally. And there's parts of the world that water consumes, 50% of people's day, and especially women's days. And if one were to apply this in those contexts, how would that be captured as a factor?
Great. Should we go on or should we get the second question?
Can we just get this? Is it okay if we just catch the second questions?
Yeah, so it's just a follow-up question on the previous one that was raised earlier. So like I understand that there are various studies that use various indicators for happiness. And I was wondering, like, when policymakers look at the GNH, right? Do they give priority to more to one indicator than others? Because I understand that perhaps like some people argue that the subjective indicator is ultimately more important than the objective indicator. So I was wondering if policymakers might give more weight to one indicator than another. And also with regards to the indicators, I was also wondering if you could perhaps elaborate more on like how they were conceptualized in the discussions, because I was wondering if each of these indicators are necessarily independent from one another. Because for instance, like high, you could have you can sleep very well, you get high literacy, and that might be possibly correlated with satisfaction as well. So I was wondering like how these decisions came about in the negotiation or the discussions. Thanks.
Great. So we have water, and sort of do policymakers have practical priority of some over others, and how these are actually understood, the indicators are understood, their intersection.
Sabina, do you want me to go first? All right, so the first question, access to water. We have a water question under living standards dimension, and that's just access to water, whether they have access to water or not. And as I mentioned, this question might go further review for the next survey, because 99.9% of the households have access to water. So now how do we refine it further? We might say the quality of water, consistency in terms of the flow of water. And in terms of women and men, yes, we always accompany our report with gendered analysis. So there's always, looking at the female situation in Bhutan. For now, it's always lower, which means women are unhappier than men. But in terms of the increase in happiness, it has been more stark for women in comparison to men. Question number 2, in terms of subjective and objective indicators, of course, if you look at the GNH Index structure, you'll see that the subjective indicators are by design given lower weight as compared to the objective indicators. In terms of really, in terms of the selection of indicators, it was a very lengthy process. There were so many criteria that we looked in. We looked at international best practices for each of those indicators. We looked at how it translated well in terms of the local context of Bhutan, because we are a multilingual country. There are more than 21 dialects. So each of the questions had to be translated into those 21 dialects and see whether the essence of the questionnaire. So a lot of reliability and validity testing was done. That also became a contributing factor to the indicator selection. And of course, in terms of the policymakers, what they wanted was in terms of, how good or how effective is this indicator in terms of integrating into an M&E, monitoring and evaluation design. So that also became some of the criteria of the indicator selection. In terms of the correlation across these 3 indicators, obviously there is some correlation, but there are a lot of statistical tests done. Initially, back in 2000, if you look at the first questionnaire, which was out in 2004, you'll find more than 1,000 indicators. For each dimension, there were about 300, about 200 to 300 indicators, questions, sub-questions. If you counted everything, there would be about nearly 2,000 questions. It was quite this thick, and it took about 5 to 6 hours for us to ask respondent. So over the years, what we did is we actually, filtered and removed the redundant ones. So there was a lot of, deliberations and also a lot of statistical tests carried out. I cannot point to this one reason of why we selected, but it was kind of a collaborative approach, normative as well as statistical. I'll end here so that I invite Sabina to add.
Just two quick things, bear in mind in time. First of all, on subjective questions, there is a problem of having a higher weight because of the trends and the shifting frames of reference. So between 2010 and 2015, for example, the number of healthy days in objective indicator increased, but self-reported health decreased. And that probably was because of the penetration of electricity, access to international news, and the shifting of health standards. And so you can see them moving in opposite directions. So it is possible, of course, for policymakers to choose to give a higher weight to them, but they'd have to be very clear about the dangers of doing so for policy. And Fanny Koveshti at OPHI is also looking at the dangers of using subjective poverty indicators for the same reason. And finally, in terms of the 22 GNH Index book, it does have a section analyzing some of the indicator overlaps. And it is interesting because there is not a high correlation among the 33 indicators. For example, if you take positive and negative emotions and you look at how they lie, many times the people who do well in one do not do well in the other, which is very familiar if you work on these literatures. And so, but there's sections trying to analyze that. Again, there's a wealth of data in the underlying the GNH index, and the report could only share a little bit of it. But we tried to figure out what to share. But there's more work to be done when you have so much data at figuring out really what are the best angles and questions to put to it to get out ways that these profiles can inform policy.
Great. So I find it an interesting aspect that if you look at self-reported health, men report much higher or on average higher self-reported health than women, and then they die earlier. So there's a very interesting aspect of the report by men that they are fulfilling perhaps more of the dimensions, including the subjective ones. It would be interesting to know whether there is something going on akin to what we see in self-reported health. The other comments I just wanted to put in at this point was that in discussing religions, the intersection of the basic values of core religions in the world are quite strong, a huge intersection of main values. So I know I've done studies, I'm sure Sabina has as well in that respect. So there is a great deal of potential for having universal relative to those be present in this and other types of measures of well-being, flourishing, etc. Finally, following up on the miserable millionaires, yes, indeed, this is the key question now for us in my country, which is, since we neglect so entirely the non-material aspect, and since so many of the deaths that we're seeing nowadays are due directly to those non-material aspects, the fact that people have no hope in life or that they don't see a reason for life, they have some form of what I might call spiritual poverty that they face in their course of their life. That's so important now in discussing what's happening for sure in the US, that I think that we could learn a lot from the way that other folks that are more in touch with that part of themselves have expressed it and incorporated and measure it perhaps. So there's just a couple of comments, and then I'll turn it over to Sabina and the OPHI room to see if there's any more final commentary before we bring this to a close. When do you want to bring it to a close, Sabina?
I think we're on the hour, so perhaps this is a good time unless there are any burning issues.
Fantastic. So then I'll bring it to a close for today. Really have enjoyed everyone's discussion. Been really an interesting commentary on your great technique that's been employed in Bhutan. Thank you for educating the rest of us outside of Bhutan. That's it for today's edition of the HDRO IIEP OPHI Joint Series on Multidimensional Poverty. We hope to see you again in a future week. Thank you so much.